It started like any other calm, sunny afternoon at a small regional airport just outside of Atlanta. The hum of engines, the glint of the sun off airplane wings, and the low murmur of voices created a peaceful buzz that blanketed the tarmac. It was a place where dreams took off, quite literally. Among all this movement and machinery stood a young black boy, no older than 12, perched near the perimeter fence. He wasn't shouting, trespassing, or interfering with anything, just standing silently, clutching a worn-out sketch pad and a pencil that had clearly seen better days. His eyes sparkled as he watched the jets taxi across the runway. Each plane that soared into the air filled his imagination with wonder. Every detail he observed, the curve of a wing, the way the flaps moved, the thunderous power of a takeoff, he tried to capture on paper. Page after page in his sketch pad was covered in airplanes of all shapes and sizes, each drawing more detailed than the last. To him, this airport was more than just a transportation hub. It was his classroom, his dreamscape, his window into the future he hoped to one day live. Flying wasn't just a hobby in his heart. It was his destiny, but not everyone saw it that way. A middle-aged man, a private pilot in a crisp uniform, noticed the boy as he prepped his sleek aircraft for takeoff. At first glance, the pilot narrowed his eyes, confusion morphing into suspicion. He didn't see the sketch pad, or maybe he chose not to. He didn't see the harmless curiosity, the spark of a dream in the boy's eyes. Instead, he saw someone who didn't look like he belonged. Instead of walking over and starting a friendly conversation, instead of offering encouragement or even just a polite nod, he picked up his phone and called airport security. Within seconds, his voice grew sharp and dismissive. "There's a kid just hanging around the fence. Doesn't look like he's supposed to be here. Might be casing the place." Then, without even giving the situation time to develop, he called the local police, describing the boy as a loitering kid who looked out of place and might be trying something. From across the field, airport staff began to look on with concern as a police cruiser rolled up to the airport entrance. The boy, still absorbed in his sketches, barely noticed until two uniformed officers approached. Confusion washed over his face. He closed his sketch pad and clutched it tightly against his chest. One officer asked sharply, "What are you doing here, son?" The boy, now clearly shaken, stammered, I'm just watching the planes. I do it all the time." The officers looked at each other and then back at him. "Do you have permission to be here? Where are your parents?" The boy's hands trembled as he flipped open his sketch pad, showing them the pages full of airplanes. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I just like drawing them. I want to be a pilot someday." But the questions continued. No apology, no easing of tone, just assumption layered upon assumption, fueled by a phone call that never should have been made. The pilot, meanwhile, stood by his plane, watching with folded arms and an unreadable expression. Maybe he thought he'd done the right thing, maybe he didn't care, maybe he'd already moved on, but others at the airport hadn't. A few staff members murmured quietly, exchanging glances. It was clear the situation had gone from peaceful to uncomfortable fast. The boy stood there, shrinking in on himself with each passing moment, wondering if today, what started as another day of hopeful sketching, would end in a ride to the police station. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Can I call my dad?" the boy asked quietly. One of the officers, trying to maintain a professional front, allowed it. The boy pulled out his phone with shaky fingers and dialed. 3 rings. Then someone answered. "Dad," the boy said, trying not to cry. "They called the police on me at the airport again." A pause. Then calm, deliberate words from the other end of the line. Put the officer on the phone. No one at that airport, not the pilot, not the officers, not even the bystanders, was ready for what happened next. The man on the other end of the call was not just any father. He was the FAA administrator, one of the top aviation officials in the entire United States. A man who oversees the regulations, safety, and operations of every single airport and aircraft in the country. A man who worked his way up from a similar childhood, loving planes, dreaming big, and facing doubt, all the way to the highest office in aviation. And now, his son was being treated like a threat for doing the exact same thing he once did. Within minutes, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the airport. The FAA administrator stepped out, calm but firm, and made his way directly to his son. Then he turned to the officers and asked, "Is there a reason my son, who is doing nothing illegal or disruptive, is being questioned?" The officers stammered. The pilot took a step back. No one had an answer. Because the truth was obvious. This was a case of racial profiling, plain and simple. What happened next became a national headline. A powerful reminder of how far we still have to go, and how quickly perceptions can change when people realize who they're really dealing with. When the police arrived, the young boy stood frozen, confused, and visibly scared. He hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, this wasn't his first time visiting a small airport like this. He had always loved aviation, ever since he could remember. While other kids his age played video games or scrolled through endless social media feeds, This boy spent his weekends studying plane manuals, watching YouTube videos about cockpits, and sketching aircraft from every angle. The local airports were his favorite places, quiet corners where he could let his imagination take flight. Today was no different. He had ridden his bike there, sketch pad in his backpack, wearing a baseball cap with a little embroidered jet on the front. He found a good spot near the fence, settled in with his pencil, and began drawing what he saw. Twin-engine turboprops, sleek private jets, the towering control tower in the distance. He was in his element, until flashing lights and stern voices shattered the peace. The officers stepped out of their cruiser and immediately approached him with suspicion, not kindness. "What are you doing here?" one asked sharply. The boy looked up, startled. "Just drawing planes?" he said softly, holding up his sketchpad like a shield. "Do you have permission to be near this fence?" the other officer asked, scanning the area as if danger might leap out from the bushes. "Where are your parents?" came next, followed by a wave of questions he had trouble keeping up with. His hands trembled as he turned the pages of his sketchbook, showing detailed illustrations of airplanes, carefully labeled, numbered, and shaded. But it didn't seem to matter. The officers didn't respond to the drawings. They responded to the assumptions behind the call they had received. One officer even took the sketchpad from him briefly, flipping through it with a blank look, then handing it back with no apology. The boy's shoulders slumped. He felt small, like his dreams were being pulled out from under him in front of the very runway where he hoped to fly someday. Around them, people started to take notice. A couple of flight school students paused nearby, looking on uncomfortably. An older mechanic from one of the hangars stood leaning against a toolbox, arms crossed, silently watching. Everyone could feel it. The shift in the air. What had started as an innocent afternoon of plane watching had become something darker, heavier. The boy's presence, which moments ago was harmless, was now surrounded by suspicion, not because of what he was doing, but because of how he looked. And all the while, just a few dozen yards away, the pilot who made the call stood beside his aircraft, arms folded across his chest. His expression was unreadable. Was it smug, indifferent, regretful? It didn't matter. He didn't approach. He didn't check to see if his assumptions had been correct. He had seen a young black boy near his plane, and, rather than engage or inquire, he had picked up his phone and summoned the authorities. His job was to fly high, but his judgment that day was painfully low. The boy, still standing there beside the fence, now with an officer slightly behind him and one in front, felt the sting of humiliation growing in his chest. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't loitering. He was a dreamer, and now he felt criminalized for dreaming in the wrong place. He lowered his cap to shield his eyes as they welled up with tears. "Can I call my dad?" he asked, voice barely audible. One officer, perhaps realizing the weight of the situation, hesitated, then nodded. The boy pulled out his phone with shaky hands and dialed the number he knew by heart. 3 rings. Then the call connected. "Dad," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "They called the police on me at the airport again." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that holds 1,000 thoughts, 100 memories, and just enough silence to let the hurt echo. Then, with calm authority, the voice on the other end replied, "Put the officer on the phone." The boy handed it over. The officer looked at the screen, and his eyes widened slightly when he read the contact name. Still, he raised the phone to his ear. "Yes, sir. Understood," he said, his tone shifting noticeably from controlling to cautious. The officer's stance softened. He handed the phone back to the boy and cleared his throat. The other officer, noticing the change, took a step back. Something had shifted again, but this time in the boy's favor. Unbeknownst to them, the boy's father wasn't just any parent. He was the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, the highest authority in the country when it came to air travel, airport conduct, and aviation safety. A man who had spent decades breaking barriers in the industry, climbing from humble beginnings to the top of a system where few black men had ever been welcomed. He knew every code, every regulation, and more than that, he knew exactly what this moment meant. His son, simply watching planes and nurturing his dream, had been profiled, again. The police didn't just call a father. They called the man who essentially governed the very airport they were standing in. Back at the airfield, the pilot who made the call noticed the shift in body language. The officers were no longer stern. They were uncertain. The airport staff were no longer quiet. They were alert. And the boy, while still shaken, now had an unspoken shield. The truth of who his father was, and the power that came with it. The pilot had made his judgment too quickly. He had assumed too much. And now he was beginning to realize the full weight of his mistake. What happened next would ripple far beyond that airport fence. As the officers continued pressing the boy with rapid questions and suspicious looks, he clutched his sketchpad to his chest like a fragile piece of armor. His breathing had quickened, his hands were trembling, and his heart pounded with a mix of fear and confusion. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, he was just trying to do what he loved. But everything about this situation felt wrong. With all the courage he could muster, he lifted his head slightly and asked in a voice just above a whisper, "Can I call my dad?" There was a brief pause. One of the officers, who up to that point had maintained a firm, almost defensive posture, shifted slightly. Perhaps it was the boy's shaky tone. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable realization that something about this didn't sit right. He gave a short nod. "Go ahead," he said. The boy took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and with fingers still trembling, scrolled to the number he knew by heart. He tapped it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then someone picked up. "Dad," the boy said, his voice cracking. "They called the police on me again. I was just sketching planes." On the other end of the line, the voice that responded was calm, but filled with a quiet, commanding power. It wasn't a voice used to being ignored. It was the voice of a man who had spent decades climbing the ranks in a system that wasn't built for him. It was the voice of the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, the top official overseeing aviation across the entire United States. The man responsible for setting standards, enforcing regulations, and making decisions that affected every airport, every airline, every pilot, and every plane in the country. And now, his son had just been racially profiled and interrogated, again, for standing peacefully near an airport fence and doing absolutely nothing wrong. "Put the officer on the phone," the man said. The boy held the phone out to the nearest officer. "He wants to speak with you," he said, still shaken. The officer took the phone hesitantly and placed it to his ear. As soon as he heard the voice on the other end, his posture changed. His back straightened. His eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Understood, sir. We're addressing the situation," the officer stammered, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a call from a concerned parent. It was a call from someone with real authority, someone who could demand answers, investigate procedures, and take action on a national level. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but by the time the officer handed the phone back, the entire tone of the situation had shifted. And then, just minutes later, the real impact arrived. A sleek black SUV with government plates rolled onto the scene, its engine humming with purpose. It pulled up near the tarmac entrance, and the doors opened smoothly. Out stepped a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit, dark sunglasses hiding the fire in his eyes. He carried a small leather folder and a badge that, once revealed, silenced every whisper. This was no average official. This was the FAA administrator himself, one of the most powerful figures in aviation. A man not only responsible for the very airport they were standing on, but also a symbol of how far determination and integrity could take someone, no matter where they came from. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded immediate attention. He walked calmly toward the officers and the pilot, locking eyes with each of them as the tension in the air thickened like fog. "Is there a reason?" he asked, his voice cold and clear. "Why my son is being interrogated for standing near an airport fence, doing nothing but sketching planes?" No one answered. Not immediately. The pilot, who had been watching from the sidelines with a smug expression just minutes before, now stood frozen. The officers glanced at each other, realizing just how badly this situation had spiraled. You could hear a pin drop. The wind rustled across the tarmac, the distant whine of a jet engine buzzed in the background, but at that moment, all eyes were on the man who had just arrived, and the boy he had come for. The administrator stepped closer to his son and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. The boy nodded, blinking back the tears that had been threatening to fall for the past 15 minutes. Then the administrator turned his attention back to the small group before him. "This isn't the first time my son has been treated like this," he said, "but it better be the last." His words were firm, deliberate. "My son isn't a threat. He's a child, a dreamer, and more importantly, he has just as much right to be here as anyone else. More, in fact, because one day he's going to fly these planes. He's going to be in those cockpits, and you're going to wish you had treated him with more respect." The silence that followed was not just awkward, it was transformative. In that moment, everyone present, the pilot, the officers, even the bystanders, understood the gravity of what had just happened. A boy had been profiled, belittled, and intimidated, not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like. And the only thing that turned the tide was the identity of his father. But what if he hadn't been the FAA administrator? What if he had been a regular dad, working a 9-to-5, without the power or platform to demand justice? Would the story have ended differently? The officers backed off immediately, retreating in both body language and tone as the weight of their mistake settled in. One of them, clearly rattled, tried to salvage the situation. "Sir, we were just responding to a call," he began, his voice uncertain, his words trailing into the thick silence of the tarmac. But the FAA administrator raised his hand, not aggressively, but with enough quiet authority to halt the sentence midair. "And did you ask what the boy was doing?" he asked firmly. Did you even take one moment to look at his sketchbook, to see what he was actually doing? Or did you, like far too many in this country, assume that a young black child near airplanes must be suspicious? His tone never rose. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The gravity in his voice was heavier than shouting. It was laced with the experience of a lifetime navigating these same assumptions. But now he was done tolerating them quietly, especially when they targeted his child. The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. Neither had thought beyond the call they received. They had acted on assumption, not observation. Meanwhile, the pilot who had made the original call, a man who had watched the entire scene unfold from a distance with crossed arms and smug disinterest, suddenly found himself at the center of attention. He shifted uncomfortably, then finally took a few hesitant steps forward. "Look," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought, for safety," but he didn't get far. The FAA administrator turned to face him directly. "For safety?" he repeated, with a cold calmness that cut sharper than any shout. "Safety isn't a blank check to excuse profiling. It's not a tool for fear-based judgment. It's a responsibility. One you, as a licensed pilot, should understand better than anyone. You are trained to assess situations, to gather facts, to lead with clarity, not assumption." The pilot's mouth opened, but no words came. "You saw a boy near your aircraft and didn't stop to wonder if he was inspired, if he was learning, if he was dreaming," the administrator continued. "You didn't think to walk over and ask. You didn't think about the impact you could have had by simply offering encouragement. Instead, you reached for your phone. You reported him as a threat." His voice softened slightly, but the edge remained. "Do you know how many times my son has been treated like this? How many times he's been told, silently or otherwise, that he doesn't belong in the very spaces he dreams about? Spaces I've spent my life helping build and regulate?" The people nearby were silent. A small crowd had begun to form. Flight students, maintenance staff, a few curious travelers who had picked up on the tension. No one interrupted. The entire atmosphere had shifted. What started as a misguided security call had now become a moment of reckoning. "This boy," the administrator said, gesturing to his son, who stood still with his sketchpad clutched tightly, "is exactly who we need in aviation. Passionate, focused, curious. And you had the chance today, all of you, to either fuel that dream or crush it, and you almost chose to crush it." The pilot, still pale and speechless, looked down at the ground. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, muttered something about misunderstanding and miscommunication, but the damage was done. The image had already been painted. Not just the scene on the tarmac, but what it represented. It wasn't just about one boy and one bad call. It was about a system of knee-jerk assumptions and unconscious bias. It was about how quickly people can go from inspired observers to unwanted intruders, based solely on the color of their skin. And it was about what happens when someone in power finally decides to stand up and say, "Enough." The FAA administrator gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder and guided him back toward the black SUV. As they walked, he paused and looked back one last time. "Let this be a reminder," he said, his voice still calm but carrying weight, "that our industry, our world, doesn't move forward by shutting out potential. It grows when we nurture it, when we give kids space to learn, to dream, and to be treated with dignity." With that, he opened the car door and let his son slide in first. The boy glanced out of the window, eyes still wide but a bit steadier now. He hadn't said much during the confrontation, but in that moment, he didn't need to. His father had said it all. The SUV pulled away slowly, leaving behind an airport that suddenly felt much smaller than before. The pilot returned to his plane, his proud confidence now visibly shaken. The officers quietly retreated to their vehicle. Around the airport, whispers spread, not rumors, but reflection. People were talking, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. A boy with a sketchpad had unintentionally held up a mirror to an entire industry, forcing it to take a long, hard look at itself. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone sees a child standing by the fence, eyes full of wonder and dreams of flight, they'll think twice before picking up the phone. And instead, maybe they'll walk over and say, "Hey kid, want to see the cockpit?" Words spread like wildfire. Within just a few days, the story exploded across social media. Hashtags were created, videos went viral, and news outlets all over the country began covering what had happened at that small airport outside Atlanta. People were shocked, furious, and, in many ways, deeply moved. What had started as a simple sketching session for one boy had turned into a national conversation about bias, dreams, and representation. The young boy, once just a quiet observer of airplanes, suddenly became something bigger. He was no longer just another child with a sketchpad. He had become a symbol of how easily people judge based on appearances, a symbol of how deeply assumptions can cut, but also, and more powerfully, a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, of dreaming in a world that sometimes tries to steal dreams before they take off. His story touched hearts not because he was famous, but because his experience was painfully relatable, especially to parents, to kids, and to anyone who has ever been told they don't belong. The Federal Aviation Administration didn't stay silent either. Within a few days of the incident, they issued a clear and public statement, not just defending the boy, but using the moment to highlight a bigger issue. In their message, they emphasized the importance of encouraging youth to explore aviation, especially kids from underrepresented communities. They acknowledged that for too long, aviation had been a field where too many children, especially children of color, were made to feel like outsiders looking in. And they promised to do better, not just with words, but with actions. The FAA administrator, the boy's father, was invited to speak on several national platforms. His interviews didn't focus on blame or rage. Instead, he spoke with calm determination, sharing how his own journey began much like his son's, standing behind airport fences, eyes lifted to the sky, sketchbook in hand. He described the joy of watching planes roar above, of imagining what it would feel like to one day be the one flying. And he made it clear, no child should ever be made to feel like a threat simply because they're dreaming out loud in the wrong place. Meanwhile, the pilot who had called the police found himself in a very different kind of spotlight. His name quickly became public, and it trended on social media, but not in the way he might have hoped. His decision to report a harmless child as suspicious became the focal point of intense criticism. Commentators, pilots, teachers, and everyday people across the country questioned how someone entrusted with a plane could make such a judgment call based on fear and not fact. A formal investigation was launched into his conduct. His flight club and private aviation networks began distancing themselves. And while the pilot eventually released an apology, saying he never meant harm and was simply acting in the interest of safety, the damage had already been done. He had become the face of a much bigger issue, a walking reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces perception, a cautionary tale of how one careless decision can unravel a lifetime of trust. But at its heart, this story wasn't really about the pilot. It wasn't about the officers who questioned the boy. It wasn't even about the viral hashtags or trending topics. It was about a boy. A quiet, curious, wide-eyed boy with a sketchpad and a dream. A boy who didn't yell, didn't fight, didn't act out, but who stood his ground through fear and confusion. And about a father who stood by him, not just as a parent, but as a leader. A father who used his power not to punish, but to teach. Who turned a painful moment into a powerful message. Who showed the world that respect, especially for children, isn't optional, it's necessary. Because when a child sees something beautiful, like an airplane soaring through the sky, they should be allowed to dream freely. They should feel encouraged, not questioned, inspired, not intimidated. Airports, airfields, and aviation museums should be places where imagination takes off, not where innocence is grounded by suspicion. And that's exactly what this story has reminded people around the world, that the skies should be open to everyone, that greatness doesn't come from privilege or status, it comes from passion. And when that passion is met with encouragement instead of doubt, incredible things can happen. In the months that followed, the boy was invited to aviation events across the country. Pilots who heard his story offered him free lessons. Flight schools donated scholarships in his name. He even got a tour of an air traffic control tower, where he sketched everything he saw with wonder in his eyes. He never let that day at the fence stop him. In fact, it only pushed him further, because he knew now, more than ever, that he had a place in the sky. And perhaps the most important lesson came not from the investigation or the headlines, but from the quiet realization that you never truly know who someone is, or who they're connected to, until it's too late. That child you judge? He might be tomorrow's pilot, or the future head of the FAA, or the son of someone who already is. So the next time you see a young face looking up at the sky with hope, don't dismiss it. Don't call the police. Don't assume the worst. Walk up, say hello, ask what they're drawing. Share your own love for the sky. Because one small moment of kindness can launch a dream, and one careless judgment can try to destroy it. Let's choose the better path. So what can we learn from Jaden and Vanessa's story? That one small act of kindness can change your life forever. Love doesn't care about age, background, or bank accounts. It only cares about the heart. If you believe in real love, drop a heart in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories.